During the entire 226-year history of the United States, only 19 women have held the post of governor of one of our states. The 10th, 11th, or 12th woman, depending on how you count this, ever to have held the executive elected state leadership position is with us today. Her name is Barbara Roberts, governor of Oregon from 1991 to 1995, the first and to date still the only woman ever elected governor of the state of Oregon. Prior to being elected governor, she served as Oregon's elected Secretary of State, the first Democrat elected to that position in 114 years. And before that, in the 1980s, she served in the state legislature and was the first woman elected House Majority Leader in Oregon. She's also been a member of a school board and a county commissioner. One might say, up the ladder to success, Barbara Roberts, prepared and a public servant of the highest order in one's native state, someone who's a pioneer for women in political leadership. Welcome. Thank you for being with us today. We're so pleased you've agreed to talk with us.
Well, it's wonderful to be part of your project and to have a chance to discuss my time in office with you.
We look forward to it.
We certainly do. And Barbara Roberts, you didn't quit when you left office. You just kept right on going. We know that you went off to the JFK School at Harvard, the School of Government. And after that, you took an appointment at Portland State University, where you're in the Hatfield School of Government, and you're working on leadership issues, and you did as well when you were at the JFK School. I'd like you to back up a little bit in all of this. You know, when you were a little kid skipping down the streets in, what was it, Corvallis in Oregon, did it ever occur to you that anything like this might be ahead of you? I know that, you know, in the official biographies we've looked at, you began to get involved, you had an autistic child, and you wanted to ensure he got the best kind of education, so you got involved there. But what about earlier than that? Were there intimations of the kinds of things that were in store for you?
Well, you have to think about the period of history. I don't think girls ever thought of themselves as being governors or United States senators or mayors. I mean, it was just a period of time that women didn't serve in public office. And I came from a very blue-collar family. I grew up in a small town. There was nothing in the makeup of that would make you ever look at yourself and see yourself in that kind of a role. I was very fortunate to be raised in a very stable, solid household. My parents had a wonderful marriage. It was just my sister and my father was thrilled to have daughters, thought girls could do anything. He'd had 6 sisters, so he wasn't disappointed that he didn't have sons. And so I grew up in a household with a great deal of support, a great deal of encouragement, and a very supportive family. In the high school I went to, I suppose if one were paying attention and could foresee the future, you might have seen a little inkling of what was to come.
Why am I not surprised?
Well, you know, girls couldn't be student body presidents, but they could be student body secretaries. And so I was the president of a number of clubs and was student body secretary and was a salutatorian of my high school class and was always involved in organizing things in school and organizing things in the kids community and Girl Scouts or whatever. So there was a little inkling of that leadership, but there really wasn't a place for girls to lead. There really wasn't a way to step forward and lead. And so within that framework, I did as much leading as you probably could do. But I married when I was a senior in high school. I wasn't even through. I hadn't even graduated from high school when I married. And by the time I was 21, I had 2 children. I hadn't been to college. That's not exactly the pattern one would design for someone who was going to grow up to be governor. So, no. I think it was a surprise to me as it began to happen. Maybe today it's still a surprise.
Was there anyone you saw in the growing up or in your early adulthood who was kind of an inspiration for women in leadership? Were there other women who were, we call them role models these days, but, you know, just images of women in leadership?
Except for Eleanor Roosevelt. When I was a little kid,
Everyone
remember Eleanor Roosevelt, and that was the only woman who I can remember that I felt strongly that she was a leader. And I can't remember knowing other women who I ever saw that way before. It was long into my adult life before I began to see what I thought of as women who could be role models, someone to look up to.
When? Do you remember that? I'm trying to, get a sense from women who have been pioneers in this last 30-year period about who did we know, who did we see, and I shouldn't say we, but you, who went on to leadership.
Well, to some degree, I mean, I was a young woman in my 20s, I guess, when Jack Kennedy was president, and there's no question that Jacqueline Kennedy was a very different kind of role model that a lot of us hadn't seen, but the grace with which she did what she did, and the sense of leadership you had about her, even though she wasn't leading in the same way that you think of Eleanor Roosevelt leading, but there was something there that inspired, I think, a lot of young women. It was just prior to the women's movement really starting, so you were beginning to see women stepping forward. That might have been in the entertainment industry, but they were speaking on issues beyond that industry. You began to see women speaking out. Television was relatively new, and you began to see women in roles you had not seen them before. So I think there was the inkling that this was a time of change for women. It was early, and it was sort of the seeds were planted, but they really hadn't blossomed yet, and there was that happening for women in that period of time.
What was your memory of what is of the women's movement in Oregon? Because you are, in a way, you are the classic political person in this country that is someone who has deep, deep roots in her community, in her state, born, bred, and rise to leadership in your state. What about the women's movement there? Did it come? How did you intersect with it in any way?
There was no question that I had a number of friends. I was starting to be active in the Democratic Party, sort of on the bottom rung of the ladder of being a precinct committee person, and I had women friends who were part of that political activity, even though it was minuscule at the time. And out of that, as the women's movement began to grow, as Equal Rights Amendment began to be discussed, I was involved with a group of new women friends who were actually very strong feminists and were moving into that leadership role in my state. So I was fortunate to be exposed to the very early stirrings, is the way I think about it, of the women's movement in Oregon and the fight for the Equal Rights Amendment, both at our state level and at the national level, and a lot of early issues that started to come to the legislature, that started to be recognized as women's issues. And I was divorced about that time. My first husband left the state with another woman and left me with 2 children and no child support. That makes a feminist of you very quickly. And so I was involved in, looking at women's credit issues and women's rights in a number of arenas. And so out of that, I became quite active in the women's movement in my state and was, I think, I wouldn't use the term leader because I didn't think of myself as a leader yet, but I certainly was an activist with a lot of women who were clearly at the top of leadership in Oregon on women's issues at that time. They were friends. I was supportive. I joined the Women's Political Caucus when it was founded and formed, and so there was no question that had a huge impact on my sense of maybe personal strength, my sense of being able to do things that I might not have ever seen myself doing before.
And this was there when you took that initiative. Ruth and I have noticed that when we've talked with a number of women leaders, they're uncomfortable with saying I started out as a leader. But they will say, well, I wasn't uncomfortable taking initiatives here, and I did this and I did that. At the time that you went to battle for your son, was some of this experience already behind you? Were you part of the Women's Caucus? Had you done some of these other things so that you already saw yourself as someone who could move out there, or was that action a catalyst for your other activity?
I described that issue of being involved in the legislature as an advocate for my son's educational rights as really being my first understanding of what it meant to have the passion that a cause can create. There's no question in my mind that there's no passion much greater than that cause that comes from a cause, and this was my cause, my child's right to a public education. And I also think that there's probably no greater way to create passion than a mother's anger, and I had that. I was so frustrated. This was a period of time in this country when there were no federal laws giving children a right to special education or to any education if they were disabled in any way. There was no law like that in my state. And my son was sent home from school in the first grade and simply told he could not come back. You try that for a while, it really does a lot to breed anger and passion and determination. And so when I went to the legislature, I really was, I was a single mom trying to survive financially. I took a day a week off work and went down to the legislature to try to lobby a bill through the legislature that would give kids like my son the right to a public school education. And I didn't really know the political process. I was a stranger to the Capitol. I always tell people I didn't even know where the women's room was. But I was down there determined to do something for my son. And it was absolutely a total growing experience for me. I learned about the political process. I learned about the legislative process. I found out that I could talk to people about something I believed in and I could move them. That was a pretty important thing to learn about yourself, that you could literally move people's opinions. And I worked very hard that legislative session, and at the end of the session, Oregon had what we believe is the first law in the country that gave children with this kind of disabilities the right to public school. And I left that legislative session with not only that political success, but also a knowledge that I could change people's lives in that process. Now that is a pretty important thing to learn as well, that you literally can affect people's lives in the political arena. I think we think of politics as something that's not very nice, not very desirable, certainly not something a nice woman wants to be involved in. Mm-hmm. And here I had moved this mountain of government and created this educational right for my son and for other children. And in the process, I obviously changed myself dramatically because I understood that I was good at what I did, that what I had done well and effectively. And I didn't see myself yet as a leader, I really didn't, but I began to understand that I could influence people, that I could change people's mind. And maybe that's the first sign that you have a leadership skill, is that you can move others. We might not define it that way, or at least we didn't then. I think we would now. So but I was still, supporting 2 sons by myself and working a full-time job and trying to do all my politics on the side. So it was a long time before I realized what skills I really had.
What was your job at that time?
I was a bookkeeper in a construction firm.
Is that right? And supporting 2 sons and lobbying for this, though you weren't calling yourself a lobbyist probably at the time. No. And is that the time that you also belonged to the Women's Political Caucus?
Yes.
Was it the same
Yes,
period of time?
it was the same
So would it be correct to conclude that the fact that there was this social movement, and it was in the form of an organization too, the Women's Political Caucus in that case, sort of had a role in reinforcing maybe the confidence or the direction toward politics or something like that? I'm trying to get a sense.
There were a few women who'd been part of the women's movement who were elected to the legislature in that time. So there were women in the legislature who were supportive of what I was doing when I went to the legislature to get the legislation for my son. I think that made a difference because there were allies that were women I knew who were in that setting. Now, I looked at them as being far more skilled than I and far more capable than I. I just would not have seen myself in that role of doing what they did. I thought they were very brave to run for office. And I just didn't see myself in that way yet. I mean, part of what creates leadership is when you begin to understand you are a leader. And these women were younger than I, and so they came from a little bit different era. Not a lot, but enough that it made a difference in how they saw themselves. And they were better educated than I was, and so they came with a few strengths that I felt I didn't have at that point in time. And So I was, I was just trying to survive is what I was trying to do. But I was also becoming more and more politically active. I was doing more in my party, and I was starting to help candidates who were running for office by going door to door for them. And the people who helped me when I went to the legislature, those legislators, I came back and worked for them when they ran for election the next time, because suddenly that mattered a lot. And I also was starting to help women who were running for office. I didn't have any money, so I had to work. And so I would go door to door for them. I would carry their materials door to door and talk to their neighbors about how skilled and wonderful they were. So I was getting a lot of experience about politics and about how campaigns worked and what you had to do to win an election. I was beginning to help other people win elections, but still did not see myself that way. I did not see myself doing that.
So from there to running for the legislature, when did you see yourself, or how did that happen?
Well, when I ran for the school board the first time, and I actually lost my first school board race because I didn't do my homework very well. And so I stood back after I lost that race and said, this is a relatively small school district, so it wasn't very expensive to run. I stood back and said, how come I lost? What caused me to lose? And I realized I hadn't spent enough time working in the school district with committees and PTAs and budget committees and all those things that give you experience. People didn't know me well enough in the district. I'd lived in the district a few years, but I was relatively a stranger to the people there. And so I really hadn't done my work of helping them know me so that they would feel more comfortable. So I spent the next year active in the PTA. I got appointed to the budget committee for the school district. I was at every school board meeting after that, and the next year I beat the incumbent chair of the board.
And what year was that? This would be late 60s, maybe?
No, this was the early 70s. This was
70s.
about 73.
Okay. 73.
And then I was elected twice more to that board. So I served on that board for 10 years. And it was the school board that had the first majority of women on the board of any school board in our state. And then while I was still serving on the local school board, I ran for the community college board. And so I was holding both of those positions at the same time. And that was also the first community college board in Oregon that had a majority of women on it. So it was kind of like wherever I came, I must have attracted other women. I don't know what it was, but I went out and encouraged other women to run was part of it. And so I had the very interesting experience of serving on two boards that were the first in the state to have a majority of women making the decisions about that school district, that community college district.
Now, at this point in your career, were the women whose careers or whose campaigns you worked with, were they helping you, or were they urging you on, or did you have a group of friends that were urging you on to pursue these offices? How did that work?
The Women's Caucus, Women's Political Caucus, was doing a lot of recruiting of women. They were out advocating for women to run for office, for school boards, county commissions, city councils, legislature, anything they could get them to run for. And so there were a lot of women on the ballot in that period of time. And so each time I was on the ballot, I always had friends who were saying, yes, it's great, you're going to run. I mean, my friends who were in the legislature, the women friends I had in the legislature, were really encouraging me when I ran for the community college. By the time I ran for the community college, I had remarried. And I was serving on the community college board and on the school district board at the same time. Since they were both uncompensated, I could serve on them at the same time. And there was a vacancy on my county commission in my county, just a 10-month vacancy. And I just had a hysterectomy, not exactly the time you go out and decide you're going to run for something. I was not feeling very well. I just had gotten out of the hospital. And I was whining about the candidates who were submitting their names for the appointment about what a poor list it was. And my husband said to me, if it's such a poor list, why don't you put your name on it? And I said, I can't do that. I mean, I can't be a county commissioner, for heaven's sakes, I can be a school board member and community college board member. County commissioners get paid money for doing this. I can't do that. And he said, well, you're better than any of the people who are on the list. I mean, what kind of a woman does all the work you do for other women and then won't put her own name forward? And so I thought about it overnight and put my name on the list the next day, and I won that appointment to the county commission. So for 10 months, I served on the county commission of the most populated county in my state, the one where the most press happened, the most television, the most radio. I mean, it was very public, and the appointment was very public. From that point forward, I was really hooked. I was really hooked. This was a very different kind of governing than I had done before. I learned a lot on my 2 local boards, and they'd been really important, but this was big issues. We were deciding whether we were going to build a light rail in the community, and our comprehensive land use laws were being put in place in the county at the time, and I submitted a resolution that no county employees could travel to unratified ERA states, and I mean, I was going to be a real, feminist about this job, but the truth was, I learned an incredible amount in that 10 months, and one of the things I learned is how much I wanted to serve. And from that point, I really knew I wanted to run for the legislature. The problem was, my state senator was my husband. And my state representative was a very close friend, and I wasn't willing to run against either one of them. So I kept waiting for my state representative to decide he was ready to retire, and I think I probably hurried him a little bit because he knew I was standing there in the wings waiting for him to quit. And as soon as he decided he wasn't running, I ran.
So if there were any discouraging words during this period about your running, you weren't listening to them. You were getting mainly encouraging words, and you were feeling yourself that you were ready.
Yeah. And after I served on the county commission in that 10 months, there was no question my visibility, my sense of my own beginning leadership, other people viewing me as a leader, my ability to work with the press and media in a comfortable way. I wasn't uncomfortable about being on the camera or being in a newspaper. All of that helped tremendously, and there were just a lot of big issues in that 10 months, and I was involved in them and took leadership on them because I didn't know that it might not be the last time I ever had an opportunity like this, and I wasn't going to save, put all my eggs in some basket to use for some future omelet. I mean, this was the time, and I was going to take advantage of it, and I did. And so I went back and served on my husband's legislative staff for 2 sessions while I waited for my state representative to retire. And I learned a lot in that period of time, too. I was back working full-time every legislative session, and people got used to seeing me in the Capitol. I was not a stranger in that building anymore, as I had been when I was the young mom, working for my son's educational rights. Now I was not a fixture, but certainly a very familiar face in the Capitol. So when I was ready to run for the legislature, everybody in the Capitol knew who I was by then, and that made a lot of difference. I didn't have to define myself. People knew who I was.
And it's really, listening to it reminds me of how much the best school for politics is participation in this country. It's really, we say that often to students. It's not that you need to go get a degree in learning how to do public service and participate in elective office in this country. And that's such a great description of as you progress. And then you went, of course, from there to being a leader in the legislature and breaking a barrier for women by being the first woman majority leader, and then Secretary of State. And I don't want to rush you along, but I do want to hear about the governor's part of it so much.
Pretty important.
About when did you get the notion that you might want to be the governor of the state, not only serve in the lawmaking branch, but the executive, the top job?
Well, in Oregon, the Secretary of State's job is a little unusual by standards around the country. The Secretary of State is also the Lieutenant Governor, and the Secretary of State is also the State Auditor. So when you're State Auditor, you're dealing with all of the agencies of government, so you don't just do the traditional thing that many Secretaries of State do, but I also sat in the role of Lieutenant Governor. So shortly after I became Secretary of State, Governor, who was a Republican at that time, had some kind of a heart problem one night or something, and they rushed him to the hospital, and his chief of staff called me on the phone, a woman, and said, Barbara, I want to tell you this. I don't think there's anything to worry about, but they just took Governor Atiyeh to the hospital. Well, if you want to talk about blood rush, I mean, my heart was pounding and my pulse was probably way off skew, and the idea that something could happen to him and I really would be in the governor's office, if there was anything that ever made me understand what that meant, it was a very fortunate thing to happen, I think, in a way, because it really made me think of that role differently. And from that day forward, I really took my role as lieutenant governor seriously in terms of what I learned about the agencies and the people who were in those agencies and what they did, and paid more attention to every meeting I was in. I really was laying some preparation, I think, at that point. And I began to think about running when I finished being Secretary of State. And in Oregon, the Secretary of State and the governor they don't run in tandem, and they run 2 years different in time. So I could have finished my whole 8 years, assuming I was reelected, in the Secretary of State's office, and then had a 2-year span before I had to run for governor. And I was starting to look at that 94 race. I was starting to look at it. I wasn't sure I was prepared to do it, but I was starting to think about it. And then I went off to the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, the Women Executives in State Government. I won a fellowship for $6,000 or $7,000 to go to the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard for 3 weeks. And I went back to their leadership program for 3 weeks. And this strange thing happened. Among the 65 or so people who were in the class, I figured out I was a leader among these 65 people. There were 5 or 6 of us. It became clear a week or 2 into the program that we had some special leadership skills. It was a huge awakening for me. No longer was I a politician who just happened to be in elected office, but there was something else that was happening. And by the time I came back from the Kennedy School, I was really clear with myself. I wasn't saying this anyplace else, but to myself, I knew I was going to run for governor, or at least would begin to prepare myself seriously for doing that. But I had a lot of time because I wasn't going to run until the election of 1994, and this was in 1989. So that was 5 years away, a lifetime in politics. Except I did this program in the summer of '89, and in February of '90, Governor Goldschmidt, who was governor of my party, a month before the filing deadline, dropped out of the race. At the last minute, dropped out of the race for governor. No one was running against him in the primary because he was our governor and no Democrat was filed against him. And he announced one day he wasn't going to run, and I announced the next day I was. And it was almost, the kids would call this awesome, but it was an incredible step to go from literally being in my office one day and the governor announces he's not running, and the next day I announce I am. Not exactly the preparation time one would have for a campaign generally, for an announcement even. But I did it, and I thought, well, the sooner I do it, the less likely I will be to have other opponents who are in there. And it was so close to the election. I mean, we have a May primary, and this was February. That's not the preparation I had planned to make for this race that I thought was at least 5 years away. I'd been reelected Secretary of State. I'd won every county in the state, but Secretary of State is not governor. And my Republican opponent, or the likely Republican opponent, had been in the race a year. He had $1 million in the bank. He was Attorney General. He had a wonderful reputation, impeccable reputation in the state. Was a moderate Republican, and I mean, it was just sort of a done deal when the governor dropped out that he was going to win that race. I had $11,000 in my campaign account and no campaign. Not the way one wants to start out a gubernatorial campaign that you've been thinking about, but dreaming about by then maybe. And suddenly I was in the race. It was just, and people really didn't think I could win. I mean, I always tell people that really, my father and my husband may have been the only two people who thought I could win. My campaign manager didn't think so, I don't think, and my mother didn't think so. I mean, this was a pretty limited field of people who thought I could win. And the very first poll we did in the race, I was 28 points behind. This was obviously a poll we didn't share. You don't want people to know when you're that far behind, but I was 28 points behind in the first poll we took. That's a huge, of course I had till November, I mean May primary, but I had till November to turn that around, but that's a huge undertaking when you have someone really respected and capable and strong who's running on the other side, and they've got sort of all they've got all the chits in terms of money and preparation. I didn't have any of those.
Well, I want to hear the rest of this story, and a million questions come to mind, but I want to go back to the one thing that you said about the JFK School. And it's especially interesting, both of us are involved in leadership programs in college settings and university settings, and thinking about what kinds of differences they make. And I've never heard an answer quite like yours to this question of this program making a difference, which was, I discovered I was a leader when I got there. Here were 60 people or something, and I was one of half a dozen. And I realized that for the first time in that context. It's not that the experience itself taught you how to be a leader. That's not what I was hearing. It confirmed maybe your suspicion that you were. And it was strong enough that you were able to move ahead and the day after that announcement.
I don't think there's any question about this having a huge impact. I mean, the program was a very skillful, wonderful program. And I'd been to a few small programs. They were what I would call managers programs.
Yes.
This was not a management program, though it had management components. It was a leadership program. And I believed by then that you couldn't be a good leader if you didn't have any passion. And there were a lot of really skilled managers in this class, but they didn't have any passion for what they did. And I don't think you can be a real leader without passion. I also don't think you can be a real leader without risk-taking. And in that class, it became clear who the risk-takers. There was that little group of people who were willing to challenge an idea, challenge a thought, challenge a concept, not just to be contradictory, but because we didn't agree with it. And so you would see where the risk-taking came in the class, and the class then begins to treat you differently because you're out on the end of a limb occasionally, and they see you there, and they're glad you're there because they really want to ask that question or challenge, but they don't want to do it. And so I think the difference that I saw among the people who sort of rose to the top in that class to some degree was literally the fact that they were risk takers and they had a passion about what they were doing, and I think that's a requirement. And yeah.
Well, now I want to hear about what happened next. What was the hardest part of that campaign? There you were with almost no money, with a campaign director that doesn't believe in you yet. How did you turn it around?
Well, I wouldn't say she didn't believe in me. She just may not have believed I
As
could
a
win.
winner.
She believed in me, but I don't know if she believed we could win. We did some really important things, and one of them was, when you're in a race that's a real long shot, rather than getting careful, you have to get clear. And a lot of people get careful because they think they'll win more votes if they're really careful about what they're saying. And I wouldn't do that. I figured I was going to be who I was, and they could choose to vote for me or choose not to vote for me. This was a long shot at that point, and I was going to do everything I could to win, but one of those things was not pulling back. We also decided we wouldn't do anything negative, and that we would be very careful about how we did spin doctoring, as they call it, where you kind of try to make yourself be someplace person you're not, or try to play with an issue just a little bit, and you're a little bit different in one part of the state than you are in another part of the state. We decided that wasn't going to happen in this campaign. So the campaign had a real, very, very clear image of what we wanted to portray, and we stuck to the messages about what that was. And I stuck to what I believed in. And I said the same thing if I was in an environmental group or a business group or a cattle owners group. I mean, whether they liked me or not, I said what I thought was the truth in terms of policy and procedure and issues in the future. So there's a risk in that. I mean, there's no question there's a risk. And a couple of things happened in the campaign that may have been turning points, I would say. We had a measure on the ballot, an initiative on the ballot, to close the nuclear power plant in Oregon, Trojan nuclear power plant. It had been on the ballot once before and was defeated badly, and I was back again. I had been serving on the Hanford Waste Board for advisory for the Oregon and Washington people who were looking at the waste that's stored at Hanford, which is a nuclear deposit site, and so I knew a lot about nuclear waste that I didn't know before I got on that committee. And I was more and more concerned about Trojan and its safety and what we were going to do with what we were creating in terms of waste. So I was over in the central part of the state. It's the first time my Republican opponent and I have appeared together on the same podium. Newspaper Publishers Association, so every newspaper publisher in the state is there. And they're just asking us questions, not a debate, but they ask a question, and then we took turns answering the question. And we get all done, and there's a panel asking the questions, and we get all done, and there are time for 2 questions from the audience. And the first question's asked, and he and I both answered. You know, there's not much difference in our answers. Philosophically, we're pretty close together. Mm-hmm. The last question comes, and the question was, how are you going to vote on the closure of the Trojan nuclear power plant? And I know the answer to how I'm going to vote. And so I say, I'm going to vote in favor of the measure, and let me tell you why. And I talked about my experience on Hanford, what I learned about the disposal of the waste, and why I had concerns about it, and I thought it was time to close them all over the country. Well, the place went crazy. My Republican opponent, Dave, from my answer the question, said, well, we really need this, energy. We can't do that. And 2 members of my finance committee resigned that night because of my answer. And we thought, well, there went the whole ball game. There went the ball game. But the truth was, over the next 3 or 4 days, we began to get checks from all over the state and all over the country. Little checks, some a little bigger, but a lot of $50 checks, $100 checks, $25 checks, and volunteers came. And what we thought was a disaster in terms of the politics of it turned into a huge asset because I told the truth. And the question wasn't, how do you feel about this, or what do you think about this measure? It was, how are you going to vote? That's a very direct question. So out of that, there was a lot of attention on the campaign suddenly. This was a new campaign just because people were paying attention to it in a different kind of way. And it wasn't assumed that I was just going to go gently into the sunset. I think that was part of it. In the summer, in August of that year, we did something no campaign in its right mind does. We'd been working really hard raising money, and we were saving 50 cents out of every dollar was going into an account for television so that we would have the money to do a television campaign. In August, we realized that this is still a pretty long shot race. And we know that the largest newspaper in our state does a poll at Labor Day every year, every election year, and they print the major races, U.S. Senate races, governor's races, congressional races, maybe some ballot measures, and they print them right after Labor Day. So we took every bit of the television money we had and ran commercials in August when everybody says no one's watching television. We ran it, we did it all, we dumped every dime into it, and we ran these wonderful, positive television commercials, very positive stuff, very good work, and we ran these, and we waited. And when the poll came out after Labor Day, I was within 5 points of my opponent. And the race was a race. New money came in. I mean, we had risked everything, and we had moved the population. The voters were moved, and they paid attention. Nothing else was on television but me. I mean, no other TV ads for candidates. And apparently people do watch television in August. And the polls just took this huge swing, and I was in the race. Financially, I wasn't because we just spent all the money, but that came back fairly soon because of people being excited about the race. I looked viable, I was viable, and the race was a real race, and that made a huge difference. If you got time for one other campaign story, I'll tell you the one other one that probably made a difference. We did a lot of debates, my Republican opponent, myself, and there were 2 independents in a race, a libertarian and a very fundamentalist right-winger. 3 guys, me. And we did a lot of debates, and we were debating in different cities in the state. And we're down in Eugene, Oregon. My opponent lives in Eugene, his family's in Eugene, his children, his wife, all in Eugene, so it's sort of home territory, but it's a very progressive community because of the University of Oregon, very progressive community. So we did a debate where there were a series of press and media people asking questions, and it really wasn't a debate in the general sense. We're each answering the questions in turn, and they're rotating it through the panel of each of the 4 candidates. So the final question is asked, and the question is, if you were not a candidate in this race and had to vote for one of the 3 remaining candidates, for whom would you vote? That was the question. Well, I'm last this time because I've just been first. Libertarian said I wouldn't vote for any of these people because none of them are qualified and they're all taking away the rights of people. The fundamentalists said I'm the only one with morals. I would vote for myself. I wouldn't vote. And then comes my Republican opponent, the responsible Attorney General, and we just think he's going to do the right thing. The question is, you weren't in the race, who else would you vote for? And he said, well, there's nobody else on this panel qualified to be governor except me, and I would have to vote for myself. My turn, I know what the question was, and I said, well, I never ran as a woman running for governor, and I said, unlike my 3 male opponents, I'm going to answer the question we were asked. If I were not a candidate in this race, thereby not being able to vote for myself, I would vote for the only other person on this panel qualified to be governor. I would cast my vote for Dave Frohmeyer. Well, the place went crazy. It was all over television. That night, the next morning, for several days, people wrote letters to the editors. It was really a big deal. And it caused a lot of attention. A week later, we're doing a debate in Portland. Same format, and the same thing happened. I'm the last person to answer, and the reporter said, all of you were asked a question last week in Eugene. I'm going to ask it again. And he asked the same question. If you were not a candidate in this race and had to vote for one of the 3 others, who would you vote for? And the Libertarian did the same thing. The fundamentalist guy did the same thing. Now it's Dave Frohmeyer. We know he's going to clean up his act. He's not going to make that mistake again. He said, if I were not a candidate in this race, there would be nobody else on this panel qualified to be governor. And I would write in my wife, Lynn, who's a Democrat. And I said, well, deja vu. I felt like I've done this before. If I were not a candidate in this race and had to vote for one of the 3 remaining candidates at this table, I would vote for the only other person at this table qualified to be the governor of this state. I would vote for Dave Frohmeyer. Then the television ran both debate pieces over and over and over, and we gained 4 percentage points. It was one of those things where people knew what you would do. They knew what Dave would do, and they knew what I would do, and we both knew what we would do. And they knew I'd been honest, and it made a huge difference in the race. So I think sometimes, by chance, a campaign is changed or altered by a circumstances over which you may have the control of your answer, but you don't have the control of the format. You don't have the control of the circumstances, but you, in fact, do get a chance to shine in a place you may not have ever had the opportunity. And this, I guess there's one final story about, and this one is not a positive story, but my father died 3 weeks before I was elected governor. And my parents had been traveling to each of these debates around the state, just very proud, very excited. And at the end of every debate, my father didn't care who was in the room. He didn't care what anybody else thought. He'd jump up on the stage and come and give me a big hug, So there were all these pieces of footage of my father giving me a hug. And when my father died, they ran those all on television. Campaign stopped for 5 days. Dave Frohmeyer took his ads off the air. I took my ads off the air. No campaigning for 5 days. And then I came back to the campaign. But the television ran those pictures of my father over and over and over. It was like, this might be a real person. And I think that was a big deal.
Father's gift.
Yeah.
You, as long as we're describing this part of your life or mentioning it, we have to talk about your becoming governor and how, during the time that you were governor, you managed to serve and deal with your personal life. I mean, we talk a lot about the personal and the political, and in fact, when you started describing your career, and said I was a single mom with 2 children, and I went out there to fight for my son, and then I found out I could be effective. It's the personal and the political coming together. You were elected governor, and within a very short time discovered that your husband had a terminal illness, and you served as governor for, I said, in the lead-in, I said you were either the 10th, 11th, or 12th woman ever elected in the United States, and of course that was because in 1991, 3 women were elected.
Yeah.
And you were elected in 1991, and shortly,
90.
in 90, and
right.
began to serve in 91, right? Mm-hmm. And shortly thereafter learned that your husband had received this very unfortunate message about a terminal illness, and you proceeded to take care of him, to be there for him, to deal with that, and at the same time to be the governor of the state. Now, I'm summarizing that because I don't want to. I wanted to give you a moment there, and I didn't want
Thank
you to.
I appreciate that.
But I can't think of a more personal and political coming together, and how you carried that forward, and what you learned from that, or how you were able to do it, or what does that tell us about leadership or about politics?
Well, I think one of the things we know, if we know anything about leaders of the past, is that they've often served when they had other very difficult things going on in their lives. I've read those stories, I've read the books, I know about some of that. You know, they've lost a child, or their wife is ill, or they have a physical problem themselves, or other traumas are happening in their life. But it's one thing to know that, it's one thing to read about it, it's another thing to experience it. And my husband was a member of the legislature, and in the 1993 legislative session, he was the longest serving member of the Oregon legislature. Highly respected member of the legislature with great expertise and experience, particularly in education and children's issues. Those were his 2 areas of real expertise. And Frank and I were living in the governor's residence, and I was being governor, and he was being very proud of me. And he had cancer several years before that, almost 5 years before that. He'd had prostate cancer, and we were feeling pretty confident because he was getting almost to that 5-year mark, and we thought he was probably going to beat it, and that we wouldn't get a recurrence of the cancer. And in the fall of '92, so I would have been almost halfway through my term by then, not quite, but almost, Frank got a terminal cancer diagnosis, that he had lung cancer, and that it was terminal. And it was, a few months before the legislature was getting ready to begin, and we had to figure out what to do. I mean, I offered to resign, and he would not hear of that. That was not going to happen. That was pretty clear. And he really wanted to serve in the '93 legislative session, and it was really important to him that he get to serve that last session. So we determined, mostly because that was his wishes, that we wouldn't tell anybody that he had cancer. So other than our very immediate family and just a handful of very close friends, no one knew that he was terminally ill. He was in a wheelchair and used a motorized cart left over from his treatment from his earlier cancer, when he had lost the use of both of his legs with that cancer treatment. And so he was in a motorized wheelchair, and he went around the Capitol like, you hear him coming, people got out of the way. He was a madman. And so he didn't have to, he could get more weak without people seeing he was getting weak, because he had the support of this mechanism to take him around the building. And so he didn't want people to treat him like he was dying, even though he was. So we decided not to tell anyone. Well, the problem with not telling anyone is that you don't get any support. So it was a terrible legislative session. Turned out to be the longest legislative session in Oregon history. It was a bitter, bitter legislative session. Absolutely. One of the houses was Democrat. The House was Republican, the Senate was Democrat. They were fighting. They were at each other's throats. They were at my throat. Everybody was mad at everybody else. It was a terrible legislative session. It went on and on and on and on. And Frank grew more and more ill in that period of time, and I was governing. He was under hospice care at night when he got home. We were coping with what was going to happen, that we were very clear was going to happen. At home, he was very open about the fact that he was dying, so there was no pretense at home. But in the real world, nobody knew. And that went on from the fall of 92 until June of 93. And he was having so much trouble with pain, and he was taking some pain meds, and he was afraid he would look like he wasn't attentive in committee or something. And he decided he needed to tell people that something was the matter. So he actually did a press conference that actually started out to be a press release, turned into a press conference because the press wouldn't leave him alone, and told people that he had received another cancer diagnosis, and that at the end of the session he was going to give up his Senate seat. Talked about his earlier cancer, and this time it was lung cancer, and that at the end of the session he would give up his Senate seat so they could get full-time representation, because he wasn't able to do that. Well, he didn't say he was terminal in the diagnosis. We just thought it was sort of evident, and apparently it wasn't evident. So the press said they went with him, and we went down and did a press conference in the Capitol with both of us so that he could make this. He wanted them to leave him alone because he had work to do, And so if I came down and we both talked to him, then they print the story and leave him alone so he could get back to his legislative work. And so they said to him, well, when are you beginning treatment? And he said, I'm not beginning treatment. I'm not going to have treatment. Well, are you having surgery? No, I'm not having surgery. And it's clear they're like puzzled. The press is looking at him. Well, what does this mean? And you got cancer, you're not going to have treatment, you're not going to. And Frank finally said, I guess I haven't been quite clear. This is a terminal cancer diagnosis. I'm dying. And I got a year's diagnosis. And so a press person said to him, when did you get the diagnosis, Senator? And he said, last September. And there was this long pause. You could see people sort of counting on their fingers. And so then a press person said, well, Governor, when did you know about this? And I said, well, I knew about it at the exact same moment Frank knew about it. I was sitting beside him in the doctor's office when he got the diagnosis. And you can see the press just looking at, oh my God, what awful things have I said about her since September? It was very hard because suddenly, those mean things you do that are part of sort of telling the story the way you want to tell it, you feel a little uncomfortable when you're looking at a person who's about to become a widow. And so there was some of that in the processes too. And but anyway, Frank got to the end of the session. It was a terrible legislative session, as I said, just miserable. We got through the session, and he came home, and 3 days after the session ended in August, he went on oxygen permanently the rest of his life. So he was that close to not finishing the session. I mean, it was that close. And a few days after that, my sister was diagnosed with what they thought was terminal cancer. And 4 weeks before Frank died, my children's father, my first husband, died of a brain hemorrhage. So I had my former husband, my children's father, just died. My sister is under treatment for very aggressive treatment for cancer that they think she will not survive, and Frank is terminally ill, and I'm trying to be governor. That's about as much of a test as I've ever had. People talked about, campaigns being tough. They don't even have any idea. Campaigns are easy compared to this. But, my job was to be governor, and I did as much work as I could at home, and I spent as much time with Frank as I could, and I had someone helping him there, and we had hospice, and I stayed up with him a lot at night and didn't get very much sleep. Was a little sleep deprived by the time he died because I hadn't had a decent night's sleep in months and months. So if you want to talk about how you bring the personal and the leadership responsibilities together, I guess I would have to say you do it a day at a time and you do the best you do. I mean, I don't know what else to say about it. I mean, looking back on it, I think I could never have done it. I mean, if I look back on it now, I think, how did I do that? But you do what you got to do. I guess that maybe is the bottom line.
Could just add one thing, and on top of that, so that the people who are watching this interview and manage to trust us that you are a real flesh and blood human being, and that we are not,
I'm not
making you
Superwoman.
up. On top of that, there is one other thing, which is, or maybe many, but that I'm aware of, which is that you were not governing in, with Hollywood set and music and birds singing and flowers blossoming. You were governing at a time when you had taken a position on environmental issues that had made people in the timber industry very angry. You were governing at a time when people talked about a recall. And so it was not an easy period, even in that office, never mind what was going on in your personal life.
Yeah, if I had not had any of those personal issues, it would still have been a very, very difficult time to govern. People who are sort of historical experts in Oregon say I governed during the hardest 4 years in Oregon history. I don't know if that's the case. It felt like it, but I don't know if that's the case. But we had the spotted owl crisis going on, which was absolutely the most divisive issue I've ever dealt with in my life in terms of political and public issues. The night I was elected Measure 5, which was the most restrictive tax measure in our state's history, passed, so I had to budget against this huge drop out of my state budget, which meant I was cutting agencies and programs and people all the time. It was a time in America, generally, and Oregon was no exception, where you had a very anti-government complexion in the country. People were mad at government and they weren't going to take it anymore, so you had that going on. And Oregon was doing the same thing. We had 2 anti-gay ballot measures on, which were also very, very divisive issues. So there were a lot of very heavy things going on. The timber industry was furious at me for supporting the Endangered Species Act. And because of these 2 ballot measures, these anti-gay ballot measures, I took a position against both of them. So then people who were angry about that issue were angry at me. 3 recalls were filed against me. No governor in my state had ever had a recall filed against them. None of them got enough signatures to reach the ballot, and each one of them in progression got less signatures as they went on. It was a way to kind of keep you off balance all the time. I mean, I had to just forget they were there and go on with governing. So it was a very, very difficult time to govern.
And I'd like to point out, too, that not only was it a very difficult time to govern, and not only was all this going on that many people in your state didn't know about with your husband, but you were succeeding in ways that were being noticed and recognized outside the state. In '93, you got an award as one of the best managed states, and it was your governorship that was credited for that. In 1994, the JFK School and the Ford Foundation recognized you for an Innovation in Government Award. So during all this tumultuous time, you were not only governing, you were succeeding. So we really think that there was some kind of superwoman there.
Well, it's a very interesting thing. When you don't run for election again, which I didn't, Frank had just died on Halloween, and so from October till January, I was trying to figure out what I was going to do, and it became clear in January that I could not run for election, continue governing, be a full-time candidate, and have any time for grieving. And I opted to be a real person in this case, which was to grieve. So I didn't run again, but I lost my train of thought completely. I forgot where I was going with that. Oh, go ahead.
About the awards and.
Well, actually, I think that, I did want to follow up on the superwoman thing, that indeed, when we look at your career, it is so awesome. I want to come back to your assessment now as you're watching younger women coming along. What do you think the future is going to be? I think when many of them hear your story, they gasp and say, I could never, ever begin to do what that woman did. Be that as it may, where do you think we're going now?
Well, I don't think there's any question that as women hold more offices, more leadership roles, do it more successfully, prove their leadership skills and their ability to make change in positive ways, that will be easier and easier for women to serve, and easier to get elected. I don't think it's easy yet, and I don't think it's easy to serve yet. even getting elected, it's not easy to serve because you're still not quite accepted or seen as a leader. But I always tell young women, even if you don't get credit for your leadership, it doesn't make the leadership less important. The leading matters whether you're getting credit or not. And what I started to say a minute ago is one of the things that happens when you don't run for re-election, you never get to tell your success. Part of what an election does is allow you to bring your successes forward. And what happened to me was I never got to bring my successes forward, and there were lots of them.
We want to know some more about those successes. We heard about the awards, and we'd like to know some details.
Okay. Well, everyone, of course, is always happy to talk about their successes, but I ended my 4 years as governor with a record that I feel very proud of, and I'm happy to cite at least a portion of it so that you get a sort of a sense of the breadth of that record. When I finished my 4 years as governor, Oregon had the lowest unemployment it had had in 25 years and the highest investment in the state's history. So our economy was doing very well. I traveled all over Asia and Europe and the United States really working on Oregon's economy, and we had received awards for workforce development because we were doing sort of the national model for how you do workforce in the state to make sure that your workers are trained and educated and prepared so that when you bring in those companies and recruit those companies, you can supply them with good workers.
Was that the benchmarks program?
No, that was separate from the
else?
benchmarks. The workforce was a completely separate program. It was called the Workforce Quality Council, and we developed it, in counties all over the state and at the statewide level. So it got a lot of attention in terms of workforce development projects around the country. There were a lot of things that you don't generally think about when you think about a governor, but we built the most units of affordable housing in the state's history. We were building moderate income housing so that workers had a place to live because the population in Oregon grew about 250,000 people in that 4 years. It was the biggest growth we'd had in our population since the wagon trains came to Oregon. So it was a huge growth without the preparation in housing. And our SAT scores for kids in high school getting ready to go off to college were the highest in the nation 4 years running. Our HIV cases were down. Teen pregnancy was down. We were doing a lot of things in economic development that were very exciting. And we were working on education reform, so positive things were happening there. In the economic development area, we had these councils in various industries that were working to help us understand what kind of workers they needed. And then we figured out how to prepare those workers. So there was this wonderful linkage occurring between the private sector and the government sector and the education sector. In the environmental arena, we not only finished the light rail project that we started way back when I was county commissioner that I mentioned, but we now were beginning a light rail project in another part of the state that was going to connect up with the other one. So I got the first monies to make that happen. I stopped 2 unnecessary dams from being built in my state, and one of them took literally a full 4 years. It was the final federal requirement that I needed from the Secretary of Interior happened on the last week I was in office, but we stopped this dam from being built that was only going to sell electricity to California. Oregon didn't need it, and it was going to stop. It was going to come in the beautiful Klamath River, and absolutely an unnecessary project. Stopped another one that was in the project. So I reached out and did a lot of things that were kind of unusual, from environmental things to social things. We doubled the amount of money and children in state-supported Head Start, something that mattered tremendously to me. We really got very creative about how we did social services. The Oregon Health Plan came into effect, and though I hadn't designed that plan, I actually got all the federal waivers for it and all the state funding. So in the first year, we had 140,000 Oregonians who went on that health plan who'd had no health care coverage before. So there were a whole lot of things in a very broad number of arenas that we did during that period of time that I felt very proud of. And in addition, I appointed 54 judges, which was the most ever appointed by a governor in a 4-year term. And they were talented and bright and capable and ethical, and they all got elected after their appointments. So there were a lot of things that happened in that period of time that I felt very proud of, and there would have been it would have been good to run on had I run for re-election.
You also, if I remember, were very much appreciated and admired by women around the country who followed women in politics for appointing women. Tell me how you did that. How did that, was that a deliberate, conscious effort, and how'd you make that happen?
Well, it was a changing time in Oregon, and not only had women not been so much a part of government until recently, but we were also having a change of population in a lot of other ways. Our population had been predominantly white in Oregon, very few minority people in the state, and so we were now experiencing an influx of Asian population and Latino population and others out of the European base, and we really hadn't included them. And I decided it was time that inclusion was part of what we did in state government. So we really reached out to those communities as well as the women's community and said, you know, bring us your talent. Oregon has probably more boards and commissions that are appointed by the governor than almost any state in the nation. We're a very participatory state. And so I had all these boards and commissions, and we were looking for talent to put on them, and I wanted some new talent. And so in addition to the people who were always stepping forward to help in state government, we got all these wonderful new people, women, lots of women who served on boards. Many times they were the first woman who'd ever served on a given board in some industry or some area. And we got a lot of people out of the minority community, and we brought people who came from very different religious backgrounds onto some of these boards that were dealing in human services areas, because the way they viewed the world was considerably different than the way many of us viewed the world. And if we were going to deliver human services, we ought to know something about the population we were delivering to. So we really reached out to make people feel part of that state government. And I spent a lot of time traveling around the state, particularly the first couple of years, making sure that we've done that kind of outreach. And so I went into a community, I would do television, do radio, do the newspaper, do the local Qantas or whatever speech might have been available for me to do. And then we did the extras. We went in and we visited projects and we looked at what people were doing in the community. We met with new groups of people who were new immigrants to the state and tried to really figure out what we could do to make them included in Oregon. And it was a very exciting period of time.
That's a wonderful description. And I know there were leaps forward. One of my concerns, if we kind of for a minute transition to today, is that 30 years ago, when all of this changed for women in politics, you began to lobby, and then you went up this ladder, and there were other women too. And while we never went from below 5% women to 80% women in all these various offices around the country, we made some significant progress, and we all believe, I think, that it's been, women's political history has been something, maybe that same word again, awesome in this period. We've turned a corner, and women are pursuing all kinds of opportunities in leadership in the political world that they weren't before for lots of reasons we all know about. Nonetheless, 30 years later, we've come to a point at which women are about 22% of legislatures, 13% of the federal legislative system, the Congress, and I can give you the figures, it's not important. What I'm concerned about is that if you look at the pace of progress, it has been pretty steady, or it was pretty steady over the first 20 years or so, 25 maybe, but it was steady, but it was slow. Lately, it looks even as if it's slowing down, if it's slower. And I wonder if you've noticed that, if you're concerned about it, and if you agree, or if your view of it is not that different from what we're seeing. What is your thinking about that?
Well, I think there's several factors. One, the reason that there were I think there were two reasons. There were a lot of women who got into elective office sort of in that period of time, about a 15-year period. One, and this is my speculation, I don't know if it would stand to research, but my speculation is when women were told they couldn't be in the Equal Rights Amendment, they couldn't be in the Constitution, then they said, okay, we're not going to be in your Constitution, we're going to be in your courthouse, and we're going to be in your city halls, and we're going to be in your legislature. I think they were mad. And if you'd really wanted to keep women out of the political system, I think you'd have just passed the ERA and we would have moved on, and they wouldn't have been nearly so activated as they were by the failure of the ERA. So I think that was one of the things. The other thing there was a concerted effort to recruit women, to nurture them, to train them, to work on mentoring them so that they would run. And I think that made a huge difference. I think we've been very lax in that the last few years. We see women in office, and so we don't need to go to all that work, we think, and so we just move on and let nature take its course. And as a result of that, less women are being recruited and running. That, and obviously you can't elect women if you're not recruiting them or if they're not running. So that was part of it. I think the other thing is women's role in the economy has changed dramatically. It's one thing if you were a waitress or a hairdresser, or if you're very lucky a school teacher, but if you're a woman who's a manager in a big company, or you're the president of the bank, or you're doing things where you're being paid very well, it's very hard to give up a job like that and come and run for office for considerably less money and considerably, in some less prestige in some cases.
There seem to be enough men who do it all the time.
Yeah, but you look at who a lot of those men are. Those men have been, if they're lawyers, a lot of them have been in law firms a very long time, and their law firm continues to pay some salary to them while they serve in the legislature. Women don't have that. They're not partners yet in some cases, or they have not come to the point that a firm will pay for them to do their other work. I think that's one of the things. Some of these men now have women who are clearly wives who are holding very good jobs, and gives them the chance to run, and maybe their wife is not running, they're running, and their wife is helping support the family. So I think there's some economic changes that are part of this issue, and quite frankly, I mean, as ugly as politics has been the last few years, I think if it turns off men, it really turns off women. They don't feel comfortable with the ugliness of it. It is combative, it is aggressive. They worry that their children will be embarrassed about what happens in a campaign, or that they will, or that their husband will be, or that their employer will be. I think it's very, campaigns are somewhat demeaning, and the ugliness of them, I think, really turns women off more than it does even men. Should turn us all off, quite frankly, but I think that's really been a deterrent for women to get in. They see how aggressive the campaigns have become, and I think they're very, I mean, I think the best story I have is a man who's running in my running statewide in my state right now, who's held statewide public office before but hasn't run for a long time. And he talked about how different it was than it was 10 years ago. It is just a harder road. You raise more money, you have to raise more money, and people are meaner. They're just mean in this political process now. You know, women don't like the meanness. I think that's turning a lot of them away. And maybe we haven't mentored enough. Maybe we haven't reached out enough, those of us who've done the job. I mean, I mentor young women candidates all the time, but maybe we haven't done enough of it. Maybe we haven't told them that, along with all that bad stuff I told you about how they weren't fair to me and how they didn't give me credit, we tell them all the bad things about serving in public office. Maybe we're forgetting to tell them the good stuff. Maybe we're forgetting to tell them how special it is. So maybe we need to stand back a little and see if we're not being very good role models about the privilege of serving at that level of government and making those decisions and making those policy changes, and how special they are, and how good we feel about the choices we make. So if they look at us and we're whining about not getting treated fairly, and about how macho the system is, and about how we got cut out of some position we'd earned, I think we do that a lot. We whine, and legitimately. I'm not saying that whining is not legitimate. It's not very attractive, but it's probably legitimate. But it probably doesn't encourage young women to look at this as a place they want to be.
I think you're absolutely right when you talk about, maybe we think it's been solved and we don't need to continue those kinds of pushes. So in New Jersey, the Center for American Women in Politics and the Institute for Women's Leadership teamed up on a program that we're calling Ready to Run. I called a legal firm to ask if they were going to participate, and this woman said, "You bet, and I want to thank you so much, because in our firm, what they do is put the guys forward, and they never think of putting us forward, but your invitation gave me an opportunity to wave it around here and say, I want to go to this program." Good. So I think you're right on that encouragement side.
And we've always had to stand up to be noticed. I mean, we have to understand that that's probably still going to be true for a couple, maybe not a couple of generations, but certainly a couple more decades, I think. And so we have to be willing to stand up for what we believe in and stand up and say, here I am and I want to serve. But we also, I think, need to think about how we present ourselves, and not just to everyone else, but to people who might be thinking, gee, I might like to do that someday, and then they hear about how you didn't get the committee chair after you worked for 10 years for it. I mean, we cite those discriminations, forgetting that if we don't tell the other side of that coin, which is, look what I did while I was in the legislature. You know, I got all these kids in Head Start program, and I got special education for these disabled children, and, you know, I got this new law in place about alcohol treatment, and whatever it is you might have done. We don't tell those stories about our successes very often. That's why it matters that we serve. And if we don't tell those successes and we don't find a place to tell them, then young women say, well, what difference does it make? I don't want to get into that mess.
And it's important, I think, that you say young women, because one thing we've noticed in the research, the most recent research at the Center for American Women and Politics, a very recent survey of legislators, men and women in the legislature, and we've compared the results with an earlier survey taken over 10 years ago, and the age of women in the state legislatures is increasing, not decreasing. And you would have expected that after 30 years of this change, that more young women would be coming in, and that doesn't seem to be the case, and is part of my concern when I raised this issue. So opening the door, we all talked about new options, new opportunities. The door open is not enough, apparently.
Well, I think the other piece here is what you did consistently, and you never really stopped, which is taking risks again and again and again. I do think that there's a certain complacency with young women now who can look out and see all the options that are out there, and then they look at the political arena and say, "Ooh, I don't think so. There's so many other pleasant places I can go, or more pleasant places."
Well, there's no guarantee about the political process. I mean, you run for the legislature and you have to run 2 years later, you have no guarantee that you're going to be reelected. Or if you get to the legislature, you have no guarantee that you're going to be Secretary of State or State Treasurer. And there's no guarantee in it. And in a lot of industries and a lot of businesses, if you start someplace and just keep working your way up, there's some guarantee in that process. So there's a lot of uncertainty in the political process. And the other thing is, I mean, this is the part we don't like to talk about, but you have to keep your cage clean. I mean, there's no room in this day and age for ethical problems. There's no room for things you may have done in the past that in another industry you could put that in your past and say, I was just a kid, and move on. In the political process, someone's going to find out whatever it was you did, you did. It may not have been a big thing, but in a campaign ad on television, it's a big thing. So I think there's a lot of people who look at the political process and said, ooh, is my closet clean enough? You know? I mean, we all do that when we run because, you know, we're human beings, hopefully, and we part of how we learn is making mistakes, and I think most of us did when we were younger. Some when we were older, I suppose, but I think in some areas, for instance, there's parts of this country where I think a woman who's divorced still has a very hard time running. You know, I ran for the school board when I was divorced, and it didn't seem to affect my election, but I think there's parts of the country where that's more difficult. And so I think that we forget, even though those may not have been mistakes of ethics or mistakes of law, they may have been judgment mistakes, and people pay attention to them.
You said when you referred to them, we don't like to talk about it, but you have to keep your cage clean. Are there other things that we don't like to talk about that affect this? What is it we're not facing? Are there other things?
Well, one of the other things is politics is very hard on relationships. Mm-hmm. And you look at all the people you know who've served in the political arena, you've seen some divorces because it's very hard to keep a relationship solid without attention, and relationships suffer when you're doing something that takes as much energy and passion and drive and attention as a political career does. So you have to be able to do that and maintain a relationship with someone and give attention to that relationship. So I was very fortunate in that Frank and I were both doing politics.
Yes.
He understood when I had to go give a speech. He understood when I had to go to some banquet for some organization and get an award rather than be home with him. He understood that. But that wouldn't necessarily be true in all relationships.
Is it Pollyannish to suggest that one of the things that we might be able to do in the future, if we're going to ensure that more talented young people and more talented young women go into politics, is to try to find ways to change the climate out there, to change the way politics is being done? People talk about it all the time, but do you think realistically, if only, to put the most drastic case, if we're going to save the democratic system in a situation in which increasingly the good options don't look like politics to young people anymore, are there things that we can do?
Well, there are things we can do. Whether they can be done is another question, whether they will be done. I mean, campaign finance reform, and that's a very broad arena when you talk about it. It doesn't mean the same thing to everyone who hears the words. But there are some places that we can look there that might make a difference. If it was possible for people to have free time on television and there were some controlled way to be able to let them tell their stories and cite their opinions and their priorities, rather than the kind of ads you see on television that are not very, they may be effective, they're not very factual in some cases, and they're not very useful to the voter in many other cases. If voters would quit voting for people who do good campaigns. I don't mean comparison ads where you say, here's where John Smith stands and here's where Mary White stands. Not that kind of,
Attack
those
ads.
are, but attack ads where they're really, really ugly stuff happening. Citizens say they don't like those kinds of campaigns, but if you watch how they vote, they reinforce those kinds of campaigns. So voters have a responsibility too. And we don't talk very much about voter responsibility. I mean, I'm in a state that has the initiative petition. People complain about how many initiative petitions are on the ballot every year. But they don't get there unless thousands of Oregonians put their name on the petition. So if you don't want them on the ballot or you think they're awful and ugly, don't sign them. So there is a responsibility on the part of citizens to make some of these changes and not reward people who do that kind of campaigns. So I think it's very hard to make these changes because the culture is in such a place now that it'll be a long time before it swings back. I think it's better since September 11th, I have to tell you. I think we're a little more respectful of people who hold public office, as we are more respectful of police officers and firefighters. I think that's changed. I think we're a little bit more patriotic than we were before September 11th. That makes a difference because people are feeling a little more obligation to their community, to maybe their fellow human beings. Those things I think are making some change, but there's a lot more change in that it's going to take to make the political system one that we could admire again.
Does it, in your experience, not only with yourself, but some of the other women in the legislature, some of the other women in politics in Oregon, does it matter to have women there, aside from the fact that we want the opportunity?
Yes, it does. Women bring different experiences to the political process. We see the world differently. We've had different experiences for the most part. We bring a perspective that many men don't have. And I don't think there's anything that can make up for that. I've been in too many rooms, in too many meetings, in too many committee hearings where a question is raised that no one has thought about. And the question will often be raised by a woman who has a perspective. It might be about caregiving for a senior parent, or it might be about child care, or it might be about education options or opportunities, or the openness of an educational system. It could be a whole breadth of things. And some woman on the committee is going to say, well, when my children were little. Now, it's not that those men didn't have little children, but they were probably at work, and probably mom was taking care of those kids and couldn't get to the grocery store or the blood bank to give blood or down to vote or whatever. And we found that how men and women talked about voting was different because there was a little bit different experience, particularly with older women who were stay-at-home women in those years, and they had to wait till their husband got home from work as he drove and he had the car and he took her to the polls. There was a very interesting perspective about voting that was different on the part of men and women when we were interviewing middle-aged and older people about voting. So I don't think there's any question. Women make a difference, a positive difference. They bring a perspective that's different, and it's as important as the other perspectives that we should have, which is minority perspectives, racial perspectives, religious perspectives. We do a better job when we include everyone.
Well, I certainly want to thank you for not only your past leadership, but for your present leadership. You're teaching other people, you're training other people, and you continue to have a very important voice. And I know that these kinds of conversations are going to be helpful to the young people we're trying to inspire. And it's been an inspirational experience. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you. It was wonderful
Thank
to
you
be
so
here.
much for being with us.
Well, thank you for including me. I really loved having a chance to talk about this.